In the home stretch, United States President Donald Trump and Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden hit key swing states in the campaign's final week. Will it be 4 more years of Trump or a new Biden administration? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Almost 70 million Americans have already cast their ballots. Both Biden and Trump are crisscrossing the country in a final push for voters with just a week to go before Election Day. All this happening against the backdrop of a coronavirus surge. We'll get to all of that in just a moment. But let's continue now with our discussion and bring in our panel. Dr. Peter Chen-Hong is an infectious disease specialist at the University of California, San Francisco. Joining us from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Michael Johns is co-founder and leader of the U.S. Tea Party movement. With us here in Washington, Amisha Cross is a Democratic strategist and political analyst. And also in Washington with us is Seth Berenzweig. Thank you so much. He is an expert on data, privacy, and technology law. Welcome to all of you to the show. Amisha, let me start with you. As we heard from Nathan just a moment ago, Joe Biden has been campaigning in Georgia, of all places. And we know that Georgia, for the past few election cycles, has been a Republican, staunchly Republican state. Does this tell us that Joe Biden is now so confident of winning those swing states that he's now going into states like Georgia to try and get those states?
Well, it shows us that Joe Biden and the political analysts, as well as the Democratic Party, have been very strategic in acknowledging that there are quakes in the South, places that have been deeply red and conservative for a very long time, like Georgia, whose last Democratic victory was in 91-92. I think that for Joe Biden, being in Georgia speaks to a few things. One, there are 2 Senate races that are up right now that Democrats are leading in, and I think that that is one of the reasons, but also the influence of down ballot races. And just paying attention to the South now, showing that the South is not solidly red. We're seeing states where there are some major competitive places, not only in Georgia, but we see the Senate race in South Carolina. We're seeing what's happening in Arizona. There are several places where this Republican stronghold we've seen for decades just isn't the case anymore. A lot of that's due to demographic shifts. Others are due to the strong pushback that we're seeing that states are having across the country against the Trump administration, particularly how he's handled COVID-19 and how that crisis has not only led to health issues, but also a huge amount of economic divisiveness.
Peter, Amisha talked earlier on about the COVID-19 pandemic. If we look at the numbers in the United States, they continue to rise. In fact, if we link this to the politics of what is going on right now, many analysts say that this election is essentially going to be a referendum on how President Trump has handled this pandemic. And we heard some words from his chief of staff, Mark Meadows. It seemed that the administration was giving up, but just let's listen to this.
Here's what we have to do. We're not going to control the pandemic. We are going to control the fact that we get vaccines, therapeutics, and other mitigation.
So, Peter, we hear Mark Meadows telling us that we're not going to control this pandemic. The focus is now going to shift to some kind of mitigation, some kind of cure, vaccines, other kinds of medicines. What do you make of the White House response?
Well, I think it's very limited and myopic. I mean, there have been many countries that have controlled the pandemic, even in extremists. So I think by not aligning with science and not having a national strategy, even something as simple as distribution is really, I think, short-sighted, and I'm worried about it.
What would you like to hear from the administration?
I would like to see a national strategy that unites the states' response. Right now, the hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, and I think California, where I live, can do one thing, but we're at the behest of Nevada, which is right next door, Oregon. So I think, not having a national strategy with porous borders and no intelligent disease screening at the borders amongst the states is really not in the best interest of the folks. Something as simple as a mask mandate, which even Putin has instituted in Russia right now.
All right, let me bring Seth into this conversation. Seth, great to have you on the show. Let's talk about the role of social media in this election. Both Facebook and Twitter have now resorted to deleting or blocking posts that they believe are just merely rumors or not true. In the case of the Hunter Biden emails and that laptop, it's led to accusations that these social media platforms are blocking information that might be harmful to Joe Biden and his campaign. What do you make of the actions they've taken?
Well, I find it a little hard to take the Republicans and the president seriously when they claim that they're the victims of social media, when through the days of Cambridge Analytica, the Russian attacks and so forth that were prevalent in 2016, that actually was part of the context that led to, at least in part, the presidency that we're seeing today. In terms of social media, I think this is really a huge story, and it was just a couple of days ago that we received an evening press conference from the FBI regarding more attacks through social media. The notion that social media continues to get weaponized against American democracy while the American government continues to be asleep at the wheel continues to play over and over again like a bad broken record. And it's really incredible to think that there's been virtually no lessons learned as it relates to social media and its impact on the presidential election cycle over the last 4 years. And in fact, the Congress had a big hearing just a couple of weeks ago with the titans of big tech, and all the Democrats were talking about was bashing the companies on top of the head with antitrust violations. And the Republicans were talking about that they're mad that they're excluding certain conservative thoughts. So it continues to be a huge problem without any kind of a solution from the government.
Do you see regulation on the way, Seth?
The only way that I see regulation on the way from Washington is if there's a new administration. It would not be sound to think that the same people are going to suddenly do things differently. And for example, you see the Justice Department suing Google just a couple of days ago for antitrust under a statute that was enacted in the late 1800s. If you have a change in Washington, and if you have a change at the top, then I predict that you will see changes in data privacy, election security, and things of that nature, because it continues to be a very significant problem. And right now, with just days to go before the election, virtually no one in Washington is protecting us.
Amisha, let's talk about the election and voting that's already taken place. You know, November 3rd is actually not election day, it's the final day of voting. People have been voting for weeks right now, some for more than a month in some places. We know now, the latest figures we have is that almost 70 million people have already voted. What do you read into that?
Well, the diagnostics show that 80 million by this weekend in America will have voted. My read on that from what we've seen thus far is that we have a lot of new voters, those who were previously not registered. This was their first time voting in an election. We have an outsourced number of younger voters, people that under 35, under 30 crowd that is always one that campaigns want to get, but they never really show up to the polls. They're actually there now. We're seeing record numbers of minority voters, both Black, Latino, and otherwise. I think that there is a sense of urgency. The Biden campaign's push of fighting for the soul of America has really gotten into the veins of a lot of people here, and folks who might have been on the fence beforehand have seen how President Trump handled COVID-19, are going through unemployment right now, are waiting on the government to work out some type of, or were waiting on the government to work out some type of, some more checks to them to help them to stay afloat. And we saw that instead of doing that, the Republicans and the president prioritized pushing Amy Coney Barrett. And I think that there's a level of frustration among the American public, specifically minorities, who also watched the president push back hard against taking down white supremacy and calling it out. And they just feel as though their hands are tied, and the only way that they can make any bit of change is to rush to the polls. We see that in the numbers.
With the White House now saying that, look, we know that we cannot control this pandemic any longer, is there any more federal help coming? Because the numbers continue to rise.
You know, I think Trump has really delegated much of the control of the pandemic to the state level, which is really anti what we think should happen from a medical and scientific point of view, simply because the virus doesn't know any borders, doesn't know any, doesn't know any difference in SES or anything like that. In terms of aid, I think, the economic repercussions of the pandemic has really decimated a lot of communities. And, I know that California, for example, had asked for more aid and were sort of blocked in some senses. So I think From that perspective, it's been very difficult. From the medical perspective, I think we're worried about, not having enough drug once the twindemic of influenza and COVID come along later in the winter. It's looking bad, but I think it's going to look even worse in a few months.
Michael, the president has been talking about what he's been doing about the pandemic. This is what he said. Let's listen to it.
Voters are judging me on a lot of things, and one of the things we've done a really good job on is COVID. We would have millions of people, millions right now. We would have millions of people. Yeah, 2 million people. They were projecting 2.2 if we didn't do what we did.
Michael, the president says he's done a really good job, but the polls don't tell us that. 2/3 of people who were polled, and in some instances up to 3/4, tell us that the president has messed it up. He's bungled this.
Well, I mean, no one can be satisfied with the economic ramifications, the public health ramifications, the magnitude of it. A lot of popularity for the support for China has diminished as well, as China's been implicated as the origin of this, which has been a big factor.
Yeah.
I think the president I don't think you can attribute a single death to the federal government inaction. They went into action right away with, almost every component of this: mobilization of health resources, vaccine that's going to be developed in record speed. Vaccines, having worked in the health and care industry, I can tell you, take a decade to develop. We're going to get one in a year and a half. Therapeutics, encouraging. Our testing system is the best in the world.
Seth, I want to talk about a story that Michael mentioned earlier on in the show, and that is the Hunter Biden story. That story seems to have got some traction on social media, but there was a Republican senator, a very prominent senator, Ted Cruz, who said in an interview with the political multimedia site Axios, he said that in his view, the Hunter Biden story didn't not have any impact on voters at all. He said it didn't move a single voter. Do you think that is the case?
Well, I don't know how in the world he would have any basis to have any clue whether that's true or not. I think social media has a very persistent and consistent impact and could certainly affect voters. And one of the things that's so unfortunate about that situation, and I know that this Hunter Biden laptop thing has come up during the panel's discussion tonight, it's interesting that that was first delivered by Rudy Giuliani to Fox News. Fox wouldn't take it. When the New York Post published it, the person that wrote it at the New York Post wouldn't put his name on it. 2 other people on the floor refused to put their name on it, and that it was only after it was flooded through that social media channel that it was just pumped out before the final presidential debate. Listen, I have a lot of respect for opinions and people on both sides, and I really can't come to a definitive conclusion other than to say that it is highly suspect, and it continues to demonstrate that social media is having a major impact. And if the United States Senate turns Democratic as a result of this election, you will probably see new election security and data security technology laws that are coming out of Washington, and we really do need that, especially from what you've seen over the past several weeks.